is here. His novel, as I mentioned, is The New Internationals. It is from Atlantic Monthly Press. Unlikely Love Triangle in Paris, 1947. Holocaust survivor. You've got a student from colonial West Africa and a black GI. And all this set against, as we mentioned, the turmoil of post-World War II Paris in 1947 or so specifically, as I was saying. It sounds like an impossibly romantic time, but not, as we said, if you're completely broke and traumatized from that war. Really well done. It keeps you going with these characters who are really fully realized, as they say. Y'all please welcome David Wright Faladé. You have been on Thacker Mountain Radio Hour before.
Yeah, about 20 years ago, a little bit more. My first book, Fire on the Beach.
Wow.
Thank you.
Yeah, they had a young, hot host back then. I don't know, not sure what happened, but hey, this is...
Neither of us had glasses.
Yeah. This book, man, 1947 Paris, we'll talk about your research, because you must have done some research, a lot of it. But the characters, I found all of them searching for identity, if there's a common thread. Cecile is our Jewish Holocaust survivor and her family. We've got Seb, is short for,
Sebastian.
Yeah, Sebastian. And those two actually are sort of our main, we follow them a good bit. And Seb is trying to establish his identity. He's trying to get into architecture school. And he doesn't want to let down his grandparents because of the sacrifices they made. But then it turns out his grandparents also sold slaves.
Right.
So everybody has a truly complicated backstory, as they say. How was it writing all these characters? It's so deep, so rich.
The point of departure was my own backstory. I learned when I was 16 that the man who I thought was my father wasn't. So I was raised by my mom and a former black GI. He had retired. And then when I was 16, my mom said, in fact, that's not your father. It was this man that I had loved in my early life. My mom was a French Holocaust survivor. And so in learning that, when I figured out who these three people were, my mother, the Holocaust survivor, the person based on Seth, who had been the descendant of slave traders, and then the person who I thought was my father, who was the descendant of slaves, I thought, yeah, there's a story there, But then as I dug deeper, just all these different intersections sort of came to light. So it was just a matter of trying to get them into one story, really.
After you were told, she told you, how did you go about researching? You didn't go to genealogy.com or whatever it is.
In 1985, no.
No, they didn't have it. Oh, it's real life. You had to do real research.
Research.
Sorry, kids, you wouldn't understand.
I mean, originally it was just talking to people. At that point, I wasn't thinking I was going to be a writer. I was dabbling with writing and whatnot. But I lived in France after I graduated college, and I got to be really close with my grandmother, my mother's mother, and she's the character that Elodie is based on. And she was just a storyteller. She had this big life. She was born in 1907, married into this, secular Jewish family, but a Jewish family. They owned a lot of, dance halls and things around Paris. And then she was married into another Jewish family that was very secular. And all her ambitions were a little bit stifled as this person who, a woman who had these ambitions, but she was sort of forced to be kind of a glorified maid. She raised her children, the war happened, she lived these terrible experiences, and then after the war she just was like, I'm done. Her children were grown, she divorced in 1950 when divorce was not illegal in France, but not very common, and she just created her own life, and the way that she did is she became a graphologist, analyzing handwriting. And so when I meet her 30 years later, she's talking to me about these stories and these people, but then she's also showing me their handwriting, their letters, and I remember at one point I told, I can speak both languages then, I was sort of fumbling with French, but the woman I was seeing was American, from here, and I showed her a letter one time. My grandmother didn't speak English very fluently, but she looked at her letter and described that person to a T. just from looking at the script and how it was constructed. She flipped it over one time, and she goes, "These blank spaces are called chimneys," and it says something about it. She described the woman I was dating to a T, having never met her. So I was just like, yeah, there's something to work with here.
That is so creepy.
You don't want to show your handwriting.
Well, maybe my favorite character in the book is Elodie, who I'm now hearing is based on your grandmother.
Yeah.
And in the book, in the novel, Elodie is a handwriting analyst.
Yeah.
And so your grandmother was based on Elodie.
Yeah.
Man, very, very fascinating. Among the trials and tribulations of 1947 Paris and the deprivation they had to go through was something called 1% beer. It's the nastiest stuff I ever heard of.
Yeah.
Tell us about 1% beer.
Everything was rationed after the war, during the war too, but after the war for a decade, everything was rationed because it was so much scarcity. And so still today, the French government subsidizes the baguette. You know, the baguette still costs nothing because it's subsidized. And so there was this importance on just sort of providing for the people. And so anything that was remotely breadable was the word, that you could make bread from, was made for bread. And so they took the leftovers, and that's what brewers were making beer from. So it had just barely enough barley or whatever to make a beer. And that's what they were selling in cafes and bars.
Yeah, that's the point we were talking about. 1947 Paris, but again, people just didn't have money. You got people flagging down cabs, and the women are going, "Wait a minute, you got money for that?" You know, it's not. It was romantic, but not maybe as romantic as we would hope it is. You've also got the book kind of opens with neighbors standing out in the front yard watching their neighbors being hauled off.
Yeah.
In 1943 by the Vichy's, the French, right?
Yeah.
Your friends, your neighbors, the guy you were talking to yesterday about just shooting the breeze, there he is being led away. That's so powerful image.
The story I use in the novel, my grandmother told me one time, she lived in this tiny little apartment, and she told me that story where they're Jews, but they're hiding in plain sight, which is to say they have documents that don't say they're not Jewish, but they're just not enough Jewish that they're the ones to be taken away. And my grandmother comes to the window one day while my mother was at school. She's in a Catholic school, again, sort of the pretense of diminishing their Jewishness. And she sees a bus pull up in front of their house, and so she panics. But then when they get off the bus, they go next door, and this is her next door neighbor that she's known. The woman comes out of the house with her baby, and her husband is already in the bus as my grandmother's recounting it to me. And as the bus pulls away, she sees their other two children across the street. And so my grandmother, in this panic, goes to the school and takes my mother out of the school, and they walk around and they hide, in the city as best they can, just assuming they're going to be the next who are taken up. But it so marked her and traumatized her. I remember my big sister, years after my grandmother had told me this story, my big sister had gone on the website of the Holocaust Museum in Washington, and there's all the documentations of, people who were deported. And my sister found the document that my grandmother had made in the 1990s, where she recounted that story too, because it was so marking to her, so traumatized her, she just felt like it needed to be recorded. So I use that story in the book to try to capture the feeling of that moment that they,
You did, absolutely. And maybe a year or so later, the Allies' tanks rolled and they were liberated.
Yeah.
I've got about a minute left. I wanted to ask you, movies are all through this book. They love going to movies. We're having the Oxford Film Festival this very weekend, so it's very apropos. They love the Charles Boyer movies, and you've got them going to Fantasia and Disney movies, and going to see Louis Armstrong. And man, I'm just thinking, they went through this terrible war, and I mean, having their friends, it's as bad as it gets. Walt Disney and Louis Armstrong must have been quite the tonic for folks back then.
Yeah, there was this interesting tension. So my mother, and the character Cecile that my mother's based upon, was totally enamored by these things that just seemed to offer light and hope, at the same time that she was really drawn to, like Seb or her best friend Minette, who are Black French, and so closer to the colonial experience, who were more resistant to us. My mother embraces the Communist Party, but also loves Fantasia, and that tension, I think, is, I'm trying to capture that. They're just young people looking for hope and hopefulness at a moment that was really dark, in the aftermath of a really dark moment, so.
When you wish upon a star, man, it still works. It is called The New Internationals. It, again, great page turner, great characters, and gosh, it makes you think a little bit, y'all. I mean, get ready for that. But it also evokes this era that of course, I remember firsthand. But you always did a lot of research to come up with it, and what a great job you did. I believe we're going to hear a little bit from it. Y'all please welcome again our man, David Wright Faladé.
Thank y'all. So I was going to read just a few pages from a scene where Cecile, the main character who's based upon my mother, and Seb, the African from the colonies, they've been preparing for this really competitive entrance exam. And they go with friends to a cafe bar called the Rummery in the Latin Quarter. And they're just, trying to take it easy, and they meet a group of their friends there. Seb and Cecile stayed at the table of half-empty glasses, watching. She helped herself again to boobies, one of their friends, gitans. Seb, too, inhaling deeply, like he'd learned during his wartime apprenticeship in Burgundy, and holding the smoke, the holding as important as the inhale. He gawked at the spectacle of Minette, doing her own version of the jitterbugs, arm waving and haunches wriggling, the Yoruba nearby but forgotten, a crowd gathering, clapping her on. The Rummery was crammed full, front to bar, mostly with young people, mostly white, but also with a spattering of blacks. The increasing number of blacks that Seb saw everywhere around Paris still surprised him. They'd been so few before the war. It had sometimes felt like just his sisters on sea and him. But here were Africans like the Yoruba, Madagascans, others from the islands. They were men mostly, many of whom had landed with de Gaulle at Toulon and driven the Germans out of Provence. And now the black Americans too. The black Americans were always easy to distinguish, and not just by their manner of dress. They traveled together, rarely alone or in twos, and the raucous pack seemed to mostly care about being noticed, like these men tonight. One of them approached their table. He wore a long purple jacket, a canary shirt without a tie and unbuttoned at the neck, and purple trousers that ballooned down his legs and cinched at the ankle. At least he had the courtesy to remove his broad-brimmed hat. He extended a pack of Lucky Strikes. "Gitans is fine," he said in English, to both of them, but mostly towards Cecile. "But try one of mine." Seb dismissed the pack with a wave, but Cecile said, "Merci," and figured a cigarette free. "Lucky's the best butts they is." He dropped the pack on the table. "Keep 'em." Then he just stood there, smiling. Maybe your baby would care to dance," he said finally, towards Seb. "Maybe you ask the baby for herself," said Seb, the abrupt recall of his spare English surprising him. The American looked surprised too. I'll stop there.
David Wright Faladé, y'all, one more time for him. David Wright Faladé, The New Internationals. David will join us out front, sign your copy of his book, and visit with us. And great to have him back in town. And man, what a fun book. Thank you.